So we're diving right in. We're tackling a question that links some pretty different areas. Um, what is the quantum monad, and how might it unlock a deeper understanding of the Tibetan Book of the Dead for you? We know you want to understand these complex ideas quickly, so the goal here is to give some real insights without making it overly complicated.
Right. And as you will recall, we've already looked into areas where quantum physics and concepts in the Tibetan Book of the Dead seem to overlap. Like we referenced Amid Goswami's work, his explorations into the quantum nature of consciousness and those subtle bodies, and even the idea of non-locality within that ancient text. And, Vincent Crown on YouTube has also been exploring this fascinating link between quantum ideas and the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Yeah, exactly. And to mirror one of Vincent Crown's big points, what we really want to understand today is this concept of the quantum monad as maybe that last crucial element we need for a true understanding of just how deep the Tibetan Book of the Dead goes.
To really start to untangle this, let's look at an idea from the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. He believed in reincarnation and observed that a newborn's existence seems to come from one that's already ended. But he also saw a big mystery there. What exactly is the bridge between these two lives? What we're talking about today is really all about exploring that bridge.
That's interesting. So how do the quantum monad and ideas from quantum physics offer a perspective on this bridge?
Well, this is where Goswami's concept of macroquanta comes in. They're not just tiny particles. Think of them more as these fundamental units of potential that can exist in multiple states at once until they are observed. When they interact and they get more complex, like in our brains, they form bigger, more stable patterns of the macroquanta we're discussing. Physicists use these unified groups of microscopic elements to understand quantum phenomena, particularly non-locality. The important thing here is that the density of these macroquanta, it increases with complexity. And what's really crucial is that once they're excited through interaction, they need a lot of time to get back to their normal base state. They've got a long regeneration time.
Okay, so let's dig into this a bit more, this idea of a long regeneration time. How could we relate that to our everyday experiences?
Think about trying to change a habit you've had for, say, 30 years. It takes continuous effort, doesn't it? And this effort isn't just mental. It involves your body, your memory, neural pathways, your consciousness, even your attention. Your mind, which is used to those established patterns, might even fight against the change. And this relates to the macroquanta needing time to reorganize and settle back into a new baseline.
Okay, that makes sense. It's not just a cognitive decision to change. It requires this sort of persistent rewiring. Now, thinking about memory, the source material talks about classical memory versus the possibility of subtle bodies forming memory. What's the main difference there?
Classical memory, which we can compare to audio or video recordings, seems to require a physical substance, a certain density of those macroquanta to be recorded. Subtle substances, those which are characteristic of the quantum level, they don't form classical memory in the same way. This leads to a very basic question. Can our subtle bodies, the parts of us beyond the physical form, carry some form of identity or lived experience between incarnations, even if there isn't classical memory?
That's a really interesting question. The idea of something enduring, but not in a way we normally think about memory. The source material brings up the Brahman, or body of glory. What part does that play in all of this?
The Brahman, or body of glory, is described as encompassing all creatures. Manifestations happen within it, but they don't change its basic nature. So, with that in mind, what happens to the intellect, the mental component, and the vital component of the subtle body when it comes to carrying these experiences forward within this structure that holds everything?
So it's like the container remains, but what about the individual things inside it? The source material then mentions Buddhist and Hindu concepts of reincarnation, carrying tendencies and habits, sankharas and karma.
Exactly. Both of these traditions suggest that reincarnation carries forward tendencies and learned habits from one life to the next. Buddhists call these tendencies and habits sankharas, and Hindus, they call them karma. But even these ancient systems, they don't fully explain how this transfer actually happens. And this is where our science within consciousness, as the source material puts it, might shed some light.
So how do quantum physics and the role of consciousness potentially offer an explanation?
The key is in the way consciousness and quantum measurement work together. With every quantum measurement that involves an observer, that means you, consciousness doesn't just collapse the wave of possibility of the outside object being observed, it also collapses the quantum wave of possibility of the brain itself, which leads to self-reference, that feeling of I. This brain collapse also creates classical memory, the type we can imagine as a holographic recording, which contributes to our personal history and identity.
Okay, so each instance of conscious awareness is like making a snapshot of both the external reality and our internal state. But the source material also talks about a more subtle memory that's connected to these quantum measurements. How is this different from the classical memory we just talked about?
Well, the classical memory formed with each quantum measurement, it has a tendency to replay when similar stimuli come up because of those repeated measurements of a limited quantum system. It's not just the stimulus being measured again, but also the memory itself being activated again and again. Mathematically, this introduces what's called non-linearity into the system's equations, which is driven by memory feedback.
Non-linearity sounds pretty complicated. Is there a way to explain that concept simply?
Imagine a river. In its natural state, which is linear, water can flow in many different directions. But if certain paths become really worn down over time, that's the non-linearity, due to repeated memory feedback, the water is much more likely to follow those existing grooves, which limits its freedom to find new paths. But the source suggests that when quantum mathematics is freed from its charge by non-linearity, it actually opens up waves of possibility and freedom of choice.
So nonlinearity can both limit and potentially expand our choices.
Exactly. Goswami, back in 1992, he had a realization. This nonlinearity within the brain's quantum mathematics, combined with the feedback from our memories, is actually what causes a decrease in free choice, what psychologists call conditioning. We become more inclined to react in ways we've reacted before.
Which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
It aligns with how we understand habits forming.
Yeah.
Now, the source mentions a story about Goswami and a physics graduate student that helped develop this understanding.
Oh, yes. Mark Mittal, the graduate student, he came up with a solution to the nonlinear equation Goswami was working with, and it was unexpected. The main finding from this was really important. The more loaded our memory is, the more repetitions it has, the more our freedom of choice gets limited. It's like having this huge library of past responses inside us. When a similar situation comes up, we're much more likely to just pull out a response from that library.
So the more experiences we have, the stronger the tendency is to fall back on those past responses. But this tendency doesn't actually live in the physical memory itself.
That's right. While remembering something does make it more likely that you'll remember it again in the future, the tendency towards conditioned behavior isn't actually located within the physical memory stored in our brains. Instead, it comes from the probabilities within the updated quantum possibilities. We tend to choose from possibilities that have been reinforced by our past experiences.
Which brings us to the idea of quantum memory. How is that different from the classical memory that we store in our brains?
Quantum memory is basically the modified quantum mathematics that contains all this conditioning. Unlike classical memory, which is stored in physical structures, quantum memory is more like that ancient idea of the Akashic records, a memory that's written in the void. It's not deterministic, and it might even be changeable across past, present, and future all at the same time. This idea implies that the experiences and tendencies that the Tibetan Book of the Dead describes as carrying over between lives, well, maybe they aren't stored in a physical brain. Maybe they exist in this field of quantum possibilities instead. It kind of provides a possible scientific framework for a spiritual concept.
It's a very compelling idea. Memory not being limited to a physical object, but existing within a field of possibilities. The source material reminds us that our experiences involve more than just the brain. There's also the supermental, the mental, and the vital bodies.
Right. Goswami is clear that these subtle bodies can't create classical memory, which is why they're called subtle. So the big question then becomes, can subtle bodies create quantum memory?
And the answer seems to be.
The memory of the vital and mental bodies is entirely quantum memory. It comes from the conditioning of the possibility structure due to repeated experiences. The same basic dynamics as the physical body's quantum memory. When we experience certain feelings over and over, or we have these recurring thought patterns, they end up creating well-worn pathways, you could say, within our quantum possibility space for the vital and mental bodies.
The source uses a circle analogy to illustrate this layered structure. Can you explain that a bit more?
Picture concentric circles. The innermost circle, that's the physical body. It's the core, the structure that's relatively fixed. The next circle is the vital body, which represents our individual patterns of feelings. That's the functional aspect. And then the outermost circle within this individual sphere, that's the mental body. It represents our individual patterns of thought. Now, beyond all of this is the cosmic supermental intellect.
So the ego comes from us identifying with these conditioned patterns in the mental and vital bodies, along with our classical memories in the brain.
Exactly. Because the supermental can't be reflected in the physical in the same direct way, it can't be conditioned. This lines up with the theosophical idea that there's a difference between a higher mental or supramental aspect and a lower mental or vital mental part of the subtle body. So you end up with this layered structure. The physical is the most fixed, then you have the vital and mental with their fixedness coming from conditioned habits, and finally the unconditioned, universally shared supramental intellect and the body of glory.
This leads us to a pretty important finding in neurophysiology, that there's about a half-second delay between a stimulus and our verbal response. Why is this time gap so important?
Neurophysiology shows us that there's roughly a half-second delay between when a stimulus arrives and when we give a verbal response. During that first half-second, before memory is fully activated, we have this huge range of quantum response possibilities available. There's real free choice in that moment, what the source calls the primary collapse, which leads to the subject-object distinction.
So in that tiny window, we exist in a state of pure potentiality.
Yes, exactly. This experience of the quantum self, as it's called, is all about spontaneous creativity during this initial phase, before the repetitions and conditioning from our memories take over.
But then memory steps in and starts to shape our responses.
Right. Memory starts those repetitions, leading to conditioning and that tendency to go back to the library of past responses. This is where practices like meditation, breath work, holotropic breathwork, different meditative systems, ontological coaching, even psychedelics, they can all be understood as tools to interrupt this automatic collapse based on old memories. They can help us become more aware of that initial moment of choice.
And the source emphasizes the importance of actually feeling a benefit from these practices, a physical experience of it. Why is that so important?
Well, because that felt experience proves that we're actually choosing a different response than our ingrained patterns. Times of real challenge, where we make a conscious decision to take a different path, maybe by participating in 12-step programs, going on retreats, or seeking guidance. These moments show that we can bypass that old library of conditioned responses.
And this ability to choose differently in this non-local space of possibilities, what potential impact does that have?
It can bring about positive changes, new energies, shifts in vibrations, and even changes in our beliefs, although the source does wisely caution against clinging too tightly to beliefs themselves. It's about opening ourselves to new possibilities, not just trading in our old fixed ideas for new ones.
This has been a really fascinating look at some pretty intricate ideas.
Yeah.
Going back to our original question, how does understanding the quantum monad, this interplay between quantum possibilities and memory, help us understand the Tibetan Book of the Dead better?
Understanding the quantum monad, exploring these concepts of quantum memory, nonlinearity, and the potential for making conscious choices even when we're reacting automatically, it offers us a new and powerful way to interpret the journey described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It suggests that the Bardo states, those in-between phases between lives, could be times when this quantum possibility space is more accessible. They might present opportunities for liberation if we can loosen the hold that our conditioned quantum memories have on us.
So grasping this framework of memory and consciousness, based on quantum principles, helps us to really appreciate those Bardo states and the possibility of transcending habitual patterns, as described in that ancient text.
Precisely. Exploring the quantum monad lays the groundwork for a much deeper understanding of the specific stages and teachings within the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
And that brings us to the end of our investigation for today. Here's something for you to think about. If our habitual responses are indeed rooted in this quantum memory and the nonlinearity of our brain's quantum activity, what deliberate actions could you take to expand your possibilities for response and experience in this life? And potentially beyond, as hinted at in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It's definitely a question worth pondering.